Hello, my lovelies, and welcome to Based AF. I'm sociologist Ashley Frawley. This week, we're continuing our lecture series with D.L. Jacobs, where we look at how classical political economy was perceiving the possibilities developing within capitalism from Adam Smith to David Ricardo. If you enjoy these podcasts and would like to hear more of them, please consider supporting on Patreon at www.patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley. Here's what you'll hear over there in part 2 of this week's episode.
But for Marx, he's like, what is considered callous in Ricardo, this is why he's going to be attacked by someone like Thomas Hodgkin, is because he seems to not care about labor, but only about profit. And I'll lead into what he's thinking about when we talk about rent right there. And yet Marx says, actually, this is what is epoch-making and progressive about Ricardo. He says the same thing, by the way, in chapter 15 of volume 3 of Capital, right at the end of a section when he's talking about the falling rate of profit, which is that Ricardo's interest in profit, in surplus value, as Marx put it, is because he knows progress happens in the species, and it might even be in the interest of society, the sacrifice of people to the interests of the species. Now, that might sound utilitarian for a second, but if we think back to when I was talking about Kant earlier, and he has this thing about, in the idea for universal history, that it is by he says it's directed by providence, that the world that we built, we never actually get to step into, but the successive generations do. Kant says the same thing. That in other words, freedom happens in the species, right? And that if it was reliant upon merely the life of an individual, and we're all finite, freedom would never be able to develop. It would end with each of our deaths. All right, so here's a simple summary of people after Adam Smith. Every single author, Jean-Baptiste Say, Thomas Malthus, David Ricardo, James Mill, Jean-Charles Sismondi, they all start off their texts by saying, Adam Smith's like a pretty, brilliant guy, he's like an interesting Scottishman, but he's inconsistent. He says this over here and this over there. And the reason I'm saying that is because what starts to emerge post Adam Smith, the simple answer is capitalism. And so consequently, society becomes opaque to itself because it becomes self-estranged. And this is why it seems to be contradictory. And this is what Marx is tracking in the disintegration of political economy. You mentioned vulgar political economy, meaning, vulgar political economy it's not Ricardo. Malthus kind of does and kind of doesn't fall into it. It's more people like Sam Bailey and Nassau Sr. and John Stuart Mill. Malthus at times definitely falls into it. He's stupid at times, but he scores some points against Ricardo that have a meaning behind them, meaning he's kind of not the population one, not what you hate, Ashley. We're not going to talk about the population. We're talking about the market and stuff like that. But the way that, I don't know, a Moshe Postone would put it is that he'd put it like this about Marx, but I'll put it about Smith, that bourgeois society is coming into its own. It's not yet in crisis, and so it's clearer for Smith. And it's a point that Marx does, and it's always a challenge for people, that basically Marx is picking up on the regression in political economy from Smith hitherto. And that's why he can write this letter to Engels saying there's been no progress in Smith and Ricardo. And Ricardo's not really progress in the way that Smith is. It's more like Smith in crisis. So if I had to put Ricardo in a sentence, he's the last Smithian trying to hold out, and he's in total contradiction because he's trying to make bourgeois society fit when it's becoming undermined by capitalism. In Das Kapital, right, Smith is kind of the political economist, as Marx puts it, par excellence of manufacturing. It's chapter 14. And Ricardo is the representative of large-scale industry. So a simple way to put it is that I know people argue with me all the time with this, and that's fine. I'll respond. There really is not capitalism in Smith's time, at least in the way that people think about it, right? Meaning all sorts of things that they apply to Smith are actually kind of anachronistic. They're anachronistic critiques. They're not appropriate at the time. And the way in which Marx can pick up on this is not only the crisis in political economy, but I was going to talk about the Ricardian socialists today. They're going to try to repeat Smith's method and arrive at a kind of inverted result. Proudhon, right? Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who's like this kind of figure for Marx, is like the classic example. Proudhon tries to, as he puts it, his teachers are Hegel, Adam Smith, and Jesus Christ. And he literally tries to do the same dialectic of labor. And what does Marx call it? Oh, this is the poverty of philosophy. Meaning trying to give a Smithian account after the completion of the Industrial Revolution. This is what large-scale industry means, the socialization of production. There's not really socialization of production in Smith's time. There's manufacturing. I think last time I was on your podcast, I said the workers still own the means of production. And I know people hear that and they think of tools and implements. And they might even go, well, doesn't Adam Smith talk about a machine in book 1? Yeah, of course he does. So what does it mean to say that they own their means of production? They own their social cooperation. They own the socialization of labor. And you don't have to trust me, Ashley, on this point, because Andrew Urey, the philosopher of manufacturers, is saying we need a kind of revolution in industry in order to separate the workers' collective skill from them. Right? Meaning this is recognized in that time. And Robert Owen, who's not a Ricardian socialist, but kind of like he's friends with Ricardo. And David Ricardo even defends him in a very David Ricardo's like a sweet, nice man also. He defends him, David Ricardo's an MP and defends him, in the House of Commons, I believe, by saying, oh, Robert Owen, I don't agree with him on anything. His economics are whack, but he's an outstanding gentleman, has good morals, and it's okay if he's a deist. David Ricardo's background, when he's 20, he marries a Quaker, and both him and his wife Priscilla get kind of like excommunicated from their families. And Ricardo's life, a lot of people have commented on this, like his friends James Mill, the father of John Stuart Mill, and like other people like his brother Moses Ricardo, are like, oh, David Ricardo is kind of in curious areas of London at the turn of the century. And so he's kind of encountering all sorts of new theories of knowledge and things that would have not been the norm in classical education, meaning he doesn't learn like Latin and Greek like James Mill, but rather he's like into geology. And he's around, dissenting sects of Christianity like Quakers and Unitarians, and he's like around Joseph Priestley. And people have this idea that it kind of has an effect on his view of political economy. So to come back to the point, maybe I'm going off on a tangent. After Smith's death in 1790, his epigones start to try to make sense of him. And the first person I want to talk about is a guy named Jean-Baptiste Say, who's a French political economist. Actually, I hate what I'm about to say, but apparently Thomas Jefferson likes Say more than Smith. I hate saying that. I hate, I'm like pulling my hair out saying that. But Jean-Baptiste Say is at least known as like the systematizer of Smith. That, Smith writes this giant work, but if you want to get to the spark notes of it, you go and read Say. Marx really doesn't deal with Say. He just calls him inane Say and just kind of moves on. And now and then he quotes him because now and then he gets a good point in. But Say is just like he already is vulgar political economy. And why is he already vulgar political economy? As he puts it in his treatise, he goes, well, since Adam Smith, we've had a distinction between political science and economics. No, that's already like total regression. I'm not going to curse, but really stupid. That's already the total vulgarity right there. Meaning he's like, there's the economy over there, Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's just so interesting that every vulgar economist tries to do this, that you start to see these distinctions pull up around, political economy starts to break down and it becomes we've got that over there and this over here. Weber does the same thing with this sort of like division of labor in the sciences. I think Malthus does. I could be wrong.
Yep.
Yeah, but
Yep.
it's a very common thing that happens, but I'm curious as to why.
Yeah, because again, off your point about the intentionality of society, is becoming lost on them, and not out of a kind of mental mistake, but out of the kind of reification of society. So one way to kind of summarize, like Ricardo and Malthus, is they just start with the division of labor. They just and they just instantly are talking about the exchange between things. So the reason I did this long intro about like what is Adam Smith's view of the division of labor, that's totally lost on them. Totally lost on. They don't even get into it. To quote Marx, Ricardo can explain the laws of the market. No, excuse me, he describes them, he doesn't explain them. He just takes it for granted. Like, oh, okay, like chapter 1 of Ricardo's principles, he's just like, oh, value is the exchange between two different commodities, and he just proceeds. Right, so he's just concerned with, oh, these things that look like they might contradict the law of value, actually they don't. So he goes through different things like the durability of machines and different quality of labor and things like that. But if Adam Smith was here, he'd be like, wait, what the hell are we talking about? You just started off with all of these things that you assumed into existence, and you just proceed. Chapter 1 of Ricardo's principles, he's assuming division of labor, exchange value, machines. Where the hell did they come from? Money, foreign trade. He's just like throwing it all out. If you think of the architectonic of Marx's Das Kapital, you only start talking about the distribution into profit, rent, and wages at the end of volume 3. This is the Trinity formula. So Marx has to go through 3 volumes to get to where Ricardo just starts. So the very development of society is becoming opaque to its very members. Now, say when he's writing that treatise, after the French Revolution, so the French Revolution is not yet capitalism, but it ain't bourgeois society anymore. It's a kind of curious thing. Maybe if I come back on another time and talk about the French historians, French history is changing as a function of this period. It's the early 19th century. It's kind of a black hole in a lot of accounts of Marxism, because people will talk about Adam Smith and Hegel and Ricardo and Smith, but it's like, what about the 1820s and 1830s? I guess people talk about Chartism. That's a kind of background. And Ricardian socialists are writing in Chartist magazines, by the way. They're all writing in what was called the unstamped press. So in the French Revolution, because of the Napoleonic Wars, you have a massive kind of crisis, and like in terms of the economy in England, you have this summer of no harvest, I believe it's called, in 1816, and you have an economic crisis from 1817 to 1819, and there's a petition to Birmingham, this is Birmingham, England, where it's workers, it's mechanics, as they call themselves. They're like, okay, we're living with unemployment and yet abundance. So you're starting to get this kind of early image of idle machinery and idle workers, which is an absurdity for Adam Smith, right? There's no, idle workers for Adam Smith is what is that? I don't know what that is. It's not that people don't become unemployed now and then, but it's them sitting alongside each other is an absurdity of modern society. So consequently, in this period, there's a kind of second wind of interest in political economy, because people are trying to understand how to, what's the word? I can't even believe I'm blanking on this. They want to make the world better, not reform, but actually literally get back on track, right? There's a depression, and we want to get back to the wealth and prosperity, at least that we thought we had in the 18th century. So to go to Malthus and Ricardo, I'll start with them and then I'll go into the Ricardian socialists. Malthus had played on what he considered the inconsistencies in Smith. Smith sometimes talks about the value of a commodity as that which adds to the value of the materials. I think I read that. At other times, the quantity of that labor which he can command or which he can afford to purchase. I've quoted both of these sections. There's a reason I did so. Similarly, Ricardo poses the contradiction kind of as such. I'm going to summarize this as opposed to reading it. He basically says, suppose a worker is paid for a week's worth. The corn is like $100, and it drops to $50. So then somebody can ask, will the value of labor have risen or fallen? So I'm paying you $100 a week. It's fallen to $50. And Ricardo says, risen, Adam Smith must say, because his standard is the wage, and the laborer receives more of this wage for a week's labor. He's saying corn in what I'm reading, I'm kind of filling it in, but corn was understood as the basic food for laborers in England at the time, meaning everybody was eating corn. They're talking about bread. So just to recap, I know I'm maybe confusing people. Ricardo is saying, imagine somebody is being paid X amount of corn a week. It drops in price. Has the value of the laborer increased or decreased? And so here, Ricardo says, in one section, Adam Smith seems to say it's risen because the laborer can receive more corn in a week, right? It used to be $100, now it's $50, you can get double the amount. And yet in another section, Adam Smith seems to say, fallen must the same Adam Smith say, because the value of a thing depends on the power of purchasing other goods, which the possession of that object conveys, and labor has a less power of purchasing such other goods. So let me step back, because I know this is in like 19th century English, and it's like, what the hell are they saying? If we remember back to when Adam Smith was talking about, with the division of labor, you're going from the price of something is the amount of labor that it takes for you to procure something, hunt a beaver, fish, or something like that. And with the division of labor, then the value of labor is the amount of labor you can command in society. Another way to put it is your claim on the social produce, social power. This very passage of Adam Smith is becoming contradictory to Ricardo and Malthus. They actually write and spill a lot of ink over arguing which side is right. David Ricardo takes up the labor side. He's saying, oh, since Adam Smith's time, all of these political economists have confused things because they've emphasized that Adam Smith says the real value of something is how much it can command, how much labor. And what they've done is they've turned the labor theory of value into like a market theory of value, right? Meaning how valuable is something? It's how much I can purchase with it. And, you know, for Ricardo, that seems to put value in the market, and it's like, oh, this is how much I can sell, you know, at some time or something like that. And Ricardo's like, no, the first principle in political economy is labor is the basis of value. It's the labor that you apply to things. He actually says this in the preface to the Principles. He says, since Smith's time, there's been a lot of interesting research into political economy. He talks about Turgot and Sismondi and all these other people, but they've all confused things because they've focused on like the market too much, and they're forgetting the first principle. And that's why chapter 1 is on value. Now, Malthus quotes the exact same passages and says the exact same opposite. He says, no, Smith is right. It's the value you can command on the market, right? That it's not actually the labor that you apply to things, but how much you can receive for the product. And by the way, they're kind of both right? Because what Smith is thinking about is the cooperation of labor, meaning, you know, he's basically thinking like, here's what I wrote down. Here's one way of thinking about it. The debates between Malthus and Ricardo on the nature of value is it the command over labor or the labor applied to the product, but the command over labor is based on the labor applied to the product, meaning the command that I have over all the commodities on the market, corn, laborers, anything, that is based on the labor that's applied to the market. And on the other hand, the labor that's applied to something, this is not a biophysical measure. This is a social measure. And so, in fact, when I'm applying labor, it is actually the command of labor. So I know this is maybe sounding confusing what I'm saying, but like this literally is the disintegration of political economy, that they're trying to pin down a dialectic on one side. They're trying to say, is value the labor applied, or is it the value that you can command on the market? And plausibly, why could it be both? What was Smith getting at? Well, again, if you think back to why we were talking about surplus labor earlier, for Smith, it's like, well, the value of something is not just the reproduction, but also the potentiality, right? In other words, when I hire a laborer, it's like the value applied is not just that he's going to reproduce his wage, but also the surplus labor. And so what's at least there in what Malthus is he's distorting, but still picking up on, is that like what's happening in the market is we're not just exchanging equivalents, but there's some kind of development of society. Now, Malthus, the reason he becomes totally vulgar, besides the population thing, we can leave that out, which, by the way, is plagiarism. He does not invent that idea.
As Marx pointed out pretty much every time he mentioned Malthus, that plagiarist.
As that plagiarist, and, Say's law as well. So I mentioned Say earlier. The reason Marx doesn't deal with Say that much is that Say plagiarizes the physiocrats on that. We can talk about that later, but when I talk about John Gray. But, again, what Malthus, like the reason he then falls into a vulgar position is Malthus basically says profit is a markup on the product. It's literally that you're just adding, like, if you worked in retail, it's like, oh, we're going to add an additional 20% on the product. Of course, this is totally question begging, as the physiocrats already pointed out in the previous century, which is that if you just add to the price, then you're just kind of taking away from somebody else, right? Meaning the meaning behind value is that on what basis can society grow? Oh, that you can actually literally extend society, that you can produce a greater amount of social powers in society. And so, yeah, while it's possible for people to mark up, there would be no development of society as a whole. So what Malthus kind of plays on, however, the points that he scores against Ricardo is that Ricardo himself contradicts himself all over the place, because he's a genius also. Like, he's contradictory because he's brilliant. Maybe genius is not the right word, but he's brilliant. Because he'll say things like, the value of a product is the labor that's applied to it. And then in other chapters of the Principles, he'll be like, well, when you consider two nations that are trading, some nations have a lot of capital and some don't. And in those nations that have a lot of capital, profit depends on where the capital goes. And in those other nations, it depends on where the labor goes. And it's like, actually, Malthus will point it out and be like, see, you agree with me, right? Because what Malthus is thinking about is that once, like, Ricardo and Smith are focusing on maybe the firm, like the business and that activity, but once people start competing, then the activity of the producers then comes into a kind of competition with each other. And that's actually changing the character of their decision to purchase materials and labor. Meaning, I'll ask almost a dumb question, like, should you invest in a project where you would get like, a 5% return with 50% probability, or should you put your money in a bank and get, the 5% savings rate? Probably the latter, right? In other words, why take the risk or something like that? And the reason I bring that up is that once you start having developed capitalists, then when they're thinking about where to invest, there's something that Smith just says it in a kind of colloquial way, but it becomes like a technical phrase for Ricardo and Malthus, the ordinary rate of profits. Meaning the way in which we actually regulate each other is not simply through comparing our labor, but we also compare the kind of return on our investments. That, the usual rate of profits in that sector might be like 3%. So you might get a profit of 1%. Isn't that good? You're profitable? No, that's a waste of your time. You should go and put your capital elsewhere or get out of that. So the idea of the ordinary rate of profits, the usual rate of profits, in what's becoming a developed industrial capitalist society in Ricardo and Malthus's time, is impressing itself in the very way in which they're thinking about bourgeois society. And so when Malthus is saying, look, there's a price there's like a markup that's added. On the one hand, if you try to reduce value to that, you fall into this dumb old fallacy that the physiocrats already smashed in the 18th century. On the other hand, there's a reality to that, which is that actually the capitalist who's advancing money is expecting, to quote Malthus, a certain amount of profit. And those expectations are socially founded, right? If you watch Shark Tank, I know I wrote like an essay on this for Sublation, they are expecting certain kinds of profit rates. It's, people call it the economic cost or the opportunity cost. I know those are two different concepts, but they call them that thing. Meaning that what's happening in capitalism is there's an expected rate of profit. And the reason why you could arrive at something such as an expected rate of profit is only in a fully developed capitalist society, where profit is no longer like, I don't know, in antiquity, it's something that you could maybe get now and then if you could screw somebody over. It's actually becoming an essential aspect of the very reproduction of society. To quote Ashley Frowley, all that's holy is profane, all that's solid must err. I know you did this in the parrot room. So these kinds of forms, right? Things like interest rates and securities and derivatives, they're becoming necessary forms to the very existence of capitalism, right? In a certain way, it's actually insane that you get any kind of yield on the money that you put in the bank, right? In other words, if I follow Adam Smith, in the final instance, that must mean that there's some kind of guaranteed surplus labor. But what if there isn't? Then it's just a distribution between, lenders and borrowers. Like literally, if there was no surplus labor in the economy and I put my money in the bank, like my bank, and they gave me a 2% yield, I'm like robbing them. Like I'm like a feudal lord and they're just giving me money, right? And yet, obviously this is not the case. Banks are like profitable all over the place today, meaning we actually presuppose a profitable, developed society whereby not only do we advance with the expectation of profit, we advance with the expectation that we're getting a certain kind of profit. That even if I could cover my costs, no, it's bullcrap, because I could have, from a risk-adjusted basis, put things in the bank account and got the same return with half the risk. So these are the kinds of things that are like literally infiltrating the consciousness of political economy. Another thing as well, I skipped over this, but I want to emphasize this with Ricardo. So chapter 1 of Das Kapital, first sentence, Marx says, well, bourgeois society appears like a mass of commodities, right? I know I probably screwed up the line, but you guys know what I'm saying. That's really how Ricardo starts. Meaning when Ricardo talks about value, he only ever talks about it as the comparative value between different commodities. He's thinking about it in terms of what is value, and then he'll go through like a thought experiment of like you're exchanging corn and clothing, and the clothing drops in value or something. And so he's thinking about it in terms of the relative value. But like the meaning, the telos of value, that's kind of becoming opaque. He talks about value. He has a chapter on riches and value where he's polemicizing with Malthus and Say. And he's kind of like, well, there's a confusion between value and riches because riches are the amount of things but value is the difficulty in procuring them. And what Ricardo has in mind, what he wants to emphasize, is that you can have new machines and new productivity, but the way that he wants the market to operate is that we're still comparing labor, right? So if Malthus is emphasizing the kind of inequality of the production process, Ricardo's trying to emphasize the equality of the production process. Meaning he wants to say that even if you have improvements in machinery and technology and new kinds of skill, that all that's happening is that it's changing the conditions upon which we judge laborers. Right? Again, everybody ascribes this to Marx, socially necessary labor time. No. He's saying it basically already. He's saying that you can have different conditions and qualities of labor, and we're still comparing them based on the condition of their labor. So Ricardo's kind of after the equality. He's emphasizing that. Malthus, I'll cheat and I'll quote Marx on this. Marx is like Malthus generalizes the exchange between capital and labor to society as a whole. So if Ricardo seems to generalize the equality of the market to production, Malthus seems to generalize the exchange between capital and labor, that's the expropriation, to society as a whole, and just kind of assumes it constantly happening. I mean, Malthus gets kind of dumb at times in like the definitions of political economy, that he does this thing that like, it annoys me, but it also annoys Marx, so maybe I'm on good footing. And you should kind of skim through it because it's a good way of expressing what was in the air at the time. Malthus will be like, well, Sayer Ricardo has this definition of value or price. And then I'll go, but ordinary people don't really say that. So, why don't we use common sense? And he'll just make it vulgar like that. Like he just kind of, there's like a certain kind of philosophy, it's like common language philosophy, that he'll just make everything dumb by being like, nobody says terms like that, so why don't we use the normal terms? And then he just makes it very superficial and on the nose and everything like that. But returning to this Ricardo point, this Ricardo Malthus point, they begin to kind of impose the class character of capitalism onto bourgeois society. So the first line of Ricardo's principles is he says, the annual produce in any country is the combination of land, labor, and capital. This is very different than Adam Smith, who, as we were just talking about earlier, develops capital and rent and profit, meaning they presuppose labor. He develops them. Ricardo just starts with them. And so already the class character of modern capitalism, he's just kind of naturalizing. I mentioned the rude state earlier from Adam Smith. Why did I do that? Because Ricardo takes it up directly. Adam Smith's, it starts in the rude state. Labor was the first price, right? It's the real purchase price of everything. David Ricardo quotes that from Adam Smith in chapter 1. And he's like, yeah, but, Adam Smith forgot that, in order to produce anything, you need instruments. Right? And so, in order to hunt a beaver, you need like a bow and arrow. And to fish, you need a fishing rod. So why do I bring it up? Because Ricardo is reading labor and capital into the very nature of the species. Right? He doesn't even consider, well, isn't that stored up labor? Right? He corrects Adam Smith by being like, oh, Adam Smith forgot capital. So the very class character, this is why when I get to the Ricardian socialists, I'm going to argue they are Ricardian, even though there is a chapter in Noel Thompson's book, are they Smithian or are they Ricardian? Because the way in which capitalism is conditioning and determining bourgeois society is being read into the very myth of bourgeois society to itself.
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.